Welcome everyone to the first session of the University of Minnesota Extension Climate Resilient Pollinator Habitats Across Minnesota Landscapes webinar series. It's a mouthful, I know, but it was very descriptive. This is the fourth year of having our pollinator series, and we have over 1,500 people registered for this series. It's amazing. Whereas like 4 years ago, we had about 300. It's really hard to believe this program has grown so quickly. So thank you for being here, whether this is your fourth year joining us or your first time tuning in with us. I always look forward to this program every year because everyone's enthusiasm and curiosity are just very inspiring. So I hope you all enjoy it as much as I do. So on to today's presentation. Today is the first part of a four-part series. So Jeremy Hemberger will be giving his presentation on pollinators and pollination in a changing climate. These presentations will be recorded, and we'll be emailing all those recordings out on Friday, January 31st. So this Friday at the conclusion of the series. I'll also include all the resource links that will be shared during the presentations in that email, as well as just really short evaluation to help us improve our programming. So be sure to check that email out on Friday. There will also be a chance to win a Visa gift card for those that fill out the evaluation at the end of this series. So stay tuned more about that, and I'll talk more about that on Thursday. And before we get started today, I'd like to just go over how we can all interact with each other in this Zoom webinar format. Many of us are experienced with this, but just wanted to kind of go over some things in case it's been a bit rusty for you all. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. I'll be asking all of the speakers throughout the week questions only from that section. For any comments, you can use the chat feature. If there is a question that someone else has asked in the Q&A function that you are also interested in, you can also upvote the question to make sure that I ask those questions to Jeremy. And because we have a really enthusiastic group of people usually joining us, if the chat ever gets really distracting from the presentation, you can also use the up arrow down at the bottom, or it's called the caret in some realms, in the chat feature. And you can then unselect the show chat preview. So in the years past, I have also sent out the chat in the Q&A files from each day with the resource email because a lot of the audience members also share really valuable information that you might want to go back to at the end of the week. So I'll be doing that again this year, so don't worry about missing literally a thing. You'll have everything sent to your emails on Friday. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce ourselves. So today joining us is Emily Lindenfelser, Extension Educator in Wright, Meeker, and McLeod counties. Quincy Sadowski, she is in Stearns, Benton, Morrison, and Sherburne counties. We have Brenda Postels, Extension Educator. And then we have some of our speakers that are joining us today. Then we have Elaine Evans, who's also an Extension Educator in native bees. And then we have our next few speakers, Karen, Aaron, and Angie, who will be joining us later this week. So we have a great team that wraps this all together. So now I'm happy to introduce Jeremy Hemberger as today's speaker, who will be discussing how warming temperatures may continue to affect pollinators and the very beneficial services that they provide. So Jeremy is a research and scientist in the Agroecosystems group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a visiting scholar at the University of Minnesota. His research focuses on the impact of climate change and land use on insect biodiversity, with a focus on bumblebees and other pollinators in agricultural landscapes. Take it away, Jeremy.
Awesome. Thanks, Tara. So thank you so much. I'm going to try to use my little laser pointer within PowerPoint since I'm not actually physically with you all today, so you can kind of see what I'm referring to on some of these figures and graphs that we're going to look at today. So yeah, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be chatting with folks today, as Tara said, about how climate change is impacting pollinators across the world. And we're going to really be kind of taking a pretty broad approach today and looking at kind of really big scale changes that we're seeing not only in insect biodiversity, but in pollinator biodiversity specifically. And there's a few different kind of areas that I want to talk about and what we're going to cover today. And the first is really kind of centered around these kind of big picture changes in bee biodiversity that we're seeing along with a changing climate. So looking at the specific climate factors that are impacting insect biodiversity, how we actually go about measuring these responses, and how we can actually be confident that we can ascribe a changing climate to the changes in insect communities that we're seeing. In the second part, we're going to kind of look at what this sort of means for ecosystem function. And we talk about ecosystem function here broadly, not only in natural ecosystems, but also specifically in agricultural ecosystems. So what are our expectations for changing bee responses due to climate? How will pollination services, for example, might be changing due to a changing climate? So around these kind of two big topic areas, I have a couple different learning objectives that I'm keen to kind of cover and hope that people will be able to take away from the end of this presentation. The first of which is just to identify the primary climate change factors that are impacting insects and discuss why insects are particularly vulnerable to a changing climate. The second is to kind of discuss the idea of biological diversity and how it's really important for bolstering communities and the ecosystem services that they provide to us in the form of a changing climate. And the last bit here is to provide specific examples of how pollination as a service from insects might shift due to a changing climate. Here we're specifically going to be talking about warming temperatures, but there's other examples we could bring into this potentially as well. So there's no shortage of kind of scary bad news when it comes to climate change over the past few years. So I feel like every time I give a talk like this, there's a whole suite of different examples that I can bring to bear of these really kind of crazy climatic events that have been happening over the past decade or so. And they've been increasing in frequency quite a lot over the past few years. So this clip here that we're looking at on this slide is taken from 2023 when we saw these massive kind of continental-wide heat waves across the United States with these really dangerous temperatures popping up all over the place from the southern United States all the way up through the Great Plains and into the upper Midwest as well. And we saw examples of this just this past year in 2024 as well, when 2024 was the hottest year that we've ever recorded in human history. We broke records across the world, so even surpassing the kind of extremes that we saw in 2023. And we've seen a number of these examples, not only in the US, but all over the place that we're seeing these heat waves starting to occur. And heat waves are not the only example of a changing climate that we're seeing. We're also seeing a really big change in extreme weather events over the past, don't mind my cat here, over the past decade or so, with hurricanes, tornadoes, and other extreme weather events becoming much more frequent and much more severe in the past few years. So Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton were just two examples of this, where we saw these kind of century-long records broken for storm surges and for inland flooding due to hurricanes. And it's important to note here that these events, these extreme weather events, are not necessarily caused by a changing climate. We've always seen these examples of heat waves and of hurricanes and of other things, but it's the severity and the intensity and the frequency that's changing really as the climate continues to change. And when we talk about things like extreme heat, which is a subject area that I'm particularly interested in that's part of my research, it's not just increases in these extreme events that we're seeing happen, but we're also seeing these kind of long-term, more pernicious changes in temperature as a result of climate. And these are kind of the things that we hear more about when we think about global warming. That's these kind of long-term changes that we're seeing, where we expect to see anywhere between 4 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit change in the average temperature that we experience over the course of the year across the United States. And this kind of depends on the different climate projections, these models that we use to actually predict climate into the future. Which scenarios we look at kind of dictate how extreme these different temperature changes might end up being. So there's a few different major consequences of global climate change. We've kind of touched on these already. The first of which is what we think of most commonly as these increases in temperature. So on average, we've already seen relative to kind of pre-industrial normals, we've already seen about a 1.1 degrees Celsius, about a 2.5 to 3 degree Fahrenheit increase in average temperatures across the world over the last century. And this is specifically due to an increase in greenhouse gas in the upper atmosphere. We've also seen changes in the precipitation patterns, so a significant increase in drought, as well as significant increases in precipitation and flooding in certain areas as temperatures change and alter local weather patterns. This ultimately stems from the fact that we're warming our oceans really rapidly, and that's altering the Earth's water cycle across the planet. Sorry, my cat's bugging me here. So, we're also seeing, like I said before, these increases in climatic variability and extremes. So we're seeing these much wilder and prolonged swings in temperature. So just recently, we've seen this massive kind of dip in the jet stream or a polar vortex dipping all the way down into the southern United States, dumping huge amounts of snow in Arkansas and Louisiana and Florida relative to what they're used to seeing. And it's easy to think about these things sort of as proof that climate change is not happening because look, all these places are really, really cold. But this is kind of a strange paradox of a changing climate is that as temperatures warm in the Arctic, where they're increasing at rates of 2 to 4 times more than they are in other parts of the world, we start to destabilize these global weather patterns like the jet stream. And when we do that, we start to see these really wacky weather patterns start to happen where we can have extreme temperatures, extreme cold temperatures far, far down south. Whereas the Arctic historically or recently has been quite warm actually because of that. So all that Arctic air gets kind of pushed down and it's replaced by this warm air. And as far as how these changes are impacting insects and biodiversity more broadly, we see that there's a really strong risk of temperatures negatively impacting all sorts of different animal and plant species across the world. So this is a figure here from the International Panel on Climate Change from 2023, just kind of showing these different scenarios of warming, the percentage of biodiversity that's exposed to dangerous temperatures at these different rates. So right now, we're right about at this 1.5 sea level that we're seeing right now. And we can kind of see that we're primarily seeing that the biggest risk to biodiversity confined to the coastal areas and some inland areas near the equatorial boundaries. As temperatures will continue to warm, though, we'll start to see these risk areas creep inward continentally, as well as impacting vast expanses of the oceans as well. And for folks who've been reading science headlines for the past few years, we've seen a really big increase in focus on the plight of insects specifically around the globe. So this is from a 2018 feature in the New York Times Magazine, dubbed "The Insect Apocalypse is Here." And it's discussed a number of recent findings from the past decade or so, kind of leading with this kind of Rachel Carson-esque hook um, about how insects have been kind of slowly being lost from these ecosystems. And we're really noticing it quite rapidly. I mean, even folks in relatively urban areas are remark about how they don't see as many insects on their windshield of their car, for example, during the summer, or how they used to be used to seeing all these different swarms of bugs during the summer when they were kids, and now those things are no longer there. These are things that we not only are experiencing kind of anecdotally on our own, but we're starting to see these in actual rigorously collected scientific data as well. And of course, like many other things in the world, there's not really a simple answer as to why exactly insect declines are occurring. It's a whole host of different reasons. So there's this another piece that came out in 2021 in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences that was titled Death by a Thousand Cuts. So insect biodiversity really is being impacted by this whole suite of different characteristics, climate change being a very big piece of that, but it's interrelated to all these other things that are happening, like species invasions, agricultural intensification, and changes in the way that we treat the habitat that insects depend on. So I want to first kind of touch on why warming temperatures might matter so much for insects. So while we ourselves have noticed these things happening, we're a relatively adaptable group of organisms. We have this capacity to behaviorally shift what we do to control our internal and our external environment so we can go inside when it's hot outside or too cold outside. We can shiver our bodies to warm up, and all these different capacities that insects don't have the ability to do. So insects are what we call ectotherms. They are dependent on the external conditions to regulate their body temperature. So their metabolic activity is completely dependent on the external temperature conditions that they experience. So aside from food availability, temperature is the most important thing that determines insect development, insect behavior, and insect reproductive success. And we can kind of think about this through what's called a thermal performance or a thermal activity curve. So basically, all organisms on Earth we can generate these sorts of curves for, which is basically relating the temperature that they're experiencing to some important vital rate. This could be things like activity, could be reproductive rate, it could be metabolic rate, anything that we want to measure about an animal's response to its external temperature conditions. What we tend to see is that the relationship between these variables tends to follow this very predictable curve, where we see a relatively slow increase in this vital rate as temperature increases. As it starts to get warmer, there's a rapid increase, followed by a peak and then a rapid decline in vital rate as temperature increases. So we can kind of look at this as this is kind of the ideal condition for this animal that we're looking at here. The maximum rate of development, for example, is kind of peaks around this certain temperature. And for insects, if we imagine when temperatures are relatively low compared to that ideal temperature, what happens is that it ends up stretching out the time that it takes them to develop. So the total time it takes them to go from an egg to an adult, for example, might be relatively long. However, when the temperature is relatively high or close to that optimal value, that time for development is shrunk considerably as metabolic rate increases. Insects are able to consume and metabolize food faster and grow faster, ultimately getting them to the next stage for development and getting them to adulthood quicker. And because insects are ectotherms, their thermal performance curves are very, very steep. So that means basically that the introductory end right here and this downward sloping end right here tend to be very, very steep because they're very sensitive to these small increases in temperature because they're dependent on this external environment. If we were to look at a thermal performance curve for a human being, it would be much shallower on either end because we have a behavioral and a physiological capacity to adapt to these non-ideal temperature conditions far more than most insects do. So what this means ultimately is that even small increases in temperature can have a really big impact on the rate of development or for insect survival. We can see this actually play out quite well if we actually go and look at insect biodiversity kind of more broadly. So what we're going to be looking at in this figure is an example from pest insects in agricultural settings. What we're going to be comparing here is we still have this very similar thermal performance curve that we're looking at. And we're going to look at the ratio between the ideal kind of optimal temperature that an insect's vital rate is maximized and the ambient temperature that it experiences. And we're going to look at the ratio between those two and how that changes over space and how it might change over time as we continue to change the climate. What we see here is that as we increase the latitude, so basically as we go from the equator on the left-hand side of this figure to the North Pole on the right-hand side of this figure, that ratio between the ambient and optimal decreases over time. So that means basically that insects at higher latitudes, so kind of where we are here in Minnesota, tend to be farther away from their optimal value. So they have a lot more room potentially to take advantage of warmer conditions. Whereas insects that are closer to the equator are much closer to that optimal value that they need to be at for development. So that's that one-to-one line here, is highlighted in yellow. And what this ultimately means is that temperate insect species, so things that occur here in the temperates in the northern part of the US, are likely to benefit from a changing climate. As temperatures increase, they're going to be moved closer and closer to their optimal values. So this could kind of point out for these pest insects that we're looking at here, we might actually expect to see a much greater pest damage potentially due to increasing rates of herbivory and reproduction for these insects. So if we look at some of the larger consequences of warming temperatures for insects, what might we expect to see happen? So, like most things that we see biodiversity-wise, now this applies to birds, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals as well. When temperatures warm up, we expect to see a few different things. First is a change in insect range. And what we tend to see happen is that as temperatures warm, ranges will start to creep northward to kind of track their ideal temperature conditions as things get too hot on the southern part of their range and they become more optimized in the northern part of their range. We also might start to see local shifts in abundance and population dynamics. This is basically what we think of as kind of winners versus losers. So, like some species might do rather well. Historically, they might have had a population trend over time that looked like this, on this blue line here. But as temperatures get warmer, that might lead them to these more eruptive population patterns where they can start to increase their numbers more rapidly as temperatures become more optimal. We can also see increases in development or what's called volatinism. So for insects, we consider an insect that goes through a single a lifespan over the course of the year, or one life cycle over the course of the year, to be univoltine, 1 volt, one voltine. As insects develop, as temperatures continue to increase, we might start to see insect volatinism increase. So a pest insect, for example, that was able to crank through 3 generations historically might now be able to get through 5 generations in the same amount of time because temperature conditions are more optimized. We also might start to see what are called temporal effects, or what we think of as phenological shifts. So if we imagine a caterpillar and its host plant that it feeds on, historically, these things tend to be very overlapped in time because the caterpillar depends on that plant for its survival and reproduction. However, as temperatures continue to warm, not only will the development of these plants accelerate or move forwards, they might start to emerge earlier in the season. That will help happen with insects as well, but it might not happen at the exact same rate. So we can start to have this separation in phenology happen between the insect and the plant that it depends on, which can cause issues for that insect if it's the only thing that it feeds on. Monarchs are a great example of this. If milkweed starts to emerge earlier and earlier, and monarchs can't keep up with that accelerating phenological rate, we might start to see even more pronounced declines in monarchs due to climatic impact versus just a loss of milkweed from the environment. So what I'm going to do now is walk through an example from some of the work that I do, looking at bumblebees in North America and kind of look at how these warming summer temperatures have impacted this really important and awesome group of insects. So for bumblebees, what we tend to think of, like most insects, is that warmer temperatures tend to be better for them to a point. So bumblebees are a temperate adapted species. They tend to occur primarily in the Nearctic. That's basically from the whole Arctic. So that's basically from the equator northward. There's some examples of them occurring south of that as well, but primarily the higher amount of species diversity is north of the equator. And bumblebees are really, really cool because they're a strange insect. I just got done telling you that insects have basically, they're tied entirely to the external environment. They can't really regulate their body temperature like we can. But bumblebees are kind of a unique example in that they can actually actively generate and shed heat. They're still ectotherms, but they have this capacity to selectively generate or shed heat from their bodies in accordance with the external conditions. So in early spring, when bumblebee queens emerge, what they might do is if it's too cold outside, they'll actually be able to shiver their bodies. So they'll basically disconnect their wings from the wing muscles and they'll vibrate those wings and raise their body temperature up. Conversely, in the summer, when it's super, super warm outside, they're actually able to take the hot blood from within their abdomen and shunt it, or shunt it from in their thorax rather, and shunt it into their abdomen basically. And on the bottom side of their abdomen, on their belly, they're missing a lot of the hairs that cover their body, so it's relatively sparse. What that allows them to do basically is to kind of dump that heat out through their abdomen, not through like sweating like we would, but just basically through diffusion of that heat. We tend to think that bumblebees function best at ambient temperatures from somewhere between 10 and 30 degrees C. So we think about bumblebees and how hot is too hot for them. What we find is that the upper temperature threshold for these species tends to vary both within the species and within the species as well. So this figure that we're looking at here is looking at the body size of bumblebees on the x-axis and the maximum critical temperature that they can tolerate on the y-axis. And these different colors of points here are different species of bees. So for Bombus sylvicula here, this lower blue dot, this is a species that occurs at relatively high altitude. So we're looking at almost 9,000 feet above sea level here. They tend to have a much lower CT max value than species like Bombus huntii, which occur at lower altitudes and are more adapted to warm conditions, which have a CT max that's almost 10 degrees higher than this like these higher species do. What we also see is that these larger individuals tend to have a higher temperature tolerance than smaller individuals do. That's this kind of general positive relationship here between CT max and the body size. So if we think about these different characteristics, we have these within species and between species differences. How might these physiological responses actually play out across much larger scales of space? So this variability that we see in temperature tolerance is a really great substrate for natural selection and for long-term changes in populations and communities. And that's something that we can actually go and measure pretty readily. And given the rapid ongoing warming that we're seeing, do we actually see bumblebees responding at larger scales as well? So how might bumblebees actually respond to warming temperatures? We talked about a couple of these features just a few minutes ago, but just to kind of reiterate them, we expect to see a couple different responses. One is, again, this kind of poleward shift of bumblebee species northward towards higher latitudes. The other is moving upslope towards higher elevations. And this is functionally the same thing as moving to higher latitudes. You're just basically doing it in situ. So you're able to do it in the same location. You just have to move up to track that thermal environment. Not really something that happens here in Minnesota, where we have are the fifth flattest state in the nation. So that's not really something happening. We also might start to see these local shifts in abundance. This is this idea of winners versus losers, where some species can tolerate the new temperature conditions really well and and accelerate their development and become dominant, whereas other species start to decline because they're not able to tolerate the temperature conditions. And ultimately, all three of these things are going to manifest as changes in the species that are present within different communities over time. And that's something that we can measure because we have really actually pretty good data of long-term occurrence records for bumblebees across North America. So how can we actually determine if these communities are shifting in response to warming temperatures? So what we're going to do is imagine an example here. We have two different species of bumblebees. We have a blue species that occurs primarily out in the western part of the US, and this yellow species that occurs across the eastern part of the US. What we're going to do is we're going to take those occurrence records where those species are found, and we're going to take the value that they have across the average maximum summer temperature that they experience over some historical period. So here we're going to look at the years 1960 to 2000. We kind of use this as a baseline of things were relatively constant in terms of temperature. They were still kind of trickling upwards, but they hadn't really started to accelerate rapidly quite yet. What we can do then is, this is a little bit kind of mathy, but I'll explain what this formula is here, is we're basically going to take the average value of all these different points of this climate raster that we have behind these points here, and we're going to take the average of them. And what that basically tells us, it's called the species temperature index. And that's the average temperature experienced by a species during a historical period across its entire range. We can kind of basically think of this as a temperature preference. So for the yellow species here, what's the maximum temperature that it really tolerates across all the different records that we have for it over time? And the same would be true for the blue species over here. So what we can do then is we can do that exact same calculation for all the different bumblebee species that we have across of North America. So if we imagine a slightly more complicated example here, we can measure this shift in these temperature profiles of these communities using a concept called a community temperature index. And so if we imagine these four different species here in three different time points, what we can do is basically measure which species are present in each of these time points in a given location. What we can see here is that by the third time point, we've lost the green species and the purple species from this community. It no longer occurs there. And using that value that we just calculated in the previous slide, that species temperature index, we can calculate what's called a community temperature index. And that's basically an average of those species temperature indices. And that tells us basically, if we look at a community, what's the balance in that community of species that are warm adapted versus species that are cold adapted. So if our CTI value is very, very high, that means that the species present in that community are much more tolerant of warm conditions. And if that value is really, really low, that means that community is very, very cold tolerant. And that lets us measure that change over time, which is really critical here. So with that in mind, we can ask a couple of basic research questions. First, is there any evidence of an increase in bumblebee community composition over time, and specifically their tolerance to these warm conditions? And are the changes in community composition that we are seeing specifically tied to increasing summer temperatures? So, like I said, we have some really awesome data available for these species over time. So we have a bunch of different records from this giant database called the Bumblebees of North America, which is almost 1 million records at this point, across all of the lower 48 states, Mexico, and Canada as well. And this is going to be a bunch of gobbledygook that I don't need you guys to know, but basically what we're able to do with this is to build these really awesome statistical models to specifically account for a lot of the interdependencies in these data. So one of the challenging parts about working with these really big data sets is that they come from a variety of different sources. So some of them are from scientific studies, others are from just incidental observations from folks, and they're also spatially and temporally linked to one another. And that makes it kind of difficult using more traditional techniques to try to actually figure out what's going on as far as patterns in the data. But we're able to use these statistical tools to account for all these different interdependencies and specifically look at the change in summertime temperature over space and time, and if that's associated with this change in community temperature indices. That's basically what this stuff on the right-hand side of the screen means here. So when we build these models and actually look at what they tell us, what we see is that bumblebee communities have indeed become increasingly warm adapted over the last 30 or so years. So what we're looking at here is the change in that community temperature index from 1989 until present. What we see is that on average across North America, that community temperature index has increased by about 1 degree Celsius over that period of time. So that means basically all these dark areas of the map here, these reds and oranges, are areas where bumblebee communities are becoming increasingly dominated by warm adapted species, whereas there are fewer cool adapted species present in these places. And while 1 degree C change might not sound very big, when we compare that value to other taxa, such as birds and reptiles and mammals, this is about an order of magnitude or more of a change, which is pretty dramatic. And to some extent, that makes sense, right? Insects are ectotherms. They are more responsive to these external temperature conditions than some other groups of animals are. And perhaps a little bit more scary than just these changes that we're seeing is the rapidity and the temporal scope that we're seeing these changes happen. So it's really about since the year 2010 where we started to see this rapid increase in the dominance of warm adapted species in these communities. And if we just think about this anecdotally, around the year 2010 is kind of when we started to reach the point where we consistently started to break these records of extreme temperatures and warm years year to year to year. And if you've ever seen these climate stripes that folks tend to use to kind of look at how temperatures have changed, we tend to see them start to get really, really red and very dark red starting around the year 2008 and 2010. And this kind of jives roughly with what we kind of have experienced ourselves. What we see is, as well, is that these changes in these bumblebee communities are very strongly associated with long-term warming of summer temperatures. So what we're basically trying to do is we ask the question, well, is it changes in temperature from kind of a year-to-year basis, or is it like decadal or longer temperature patterns that are driving these communities? What we found is that it's actually a long-term change. So like if we average the temperature changes over a 30-year period, that's when we tend to see these larger increases in bumblebee community change. So what this figure is showing here is on the bottom axis, on the x-axis here is temperature anomalies. That's basically the deviation from the normal. So above zero is where we're seeing temperatures on average warmer than historically they have been. And when we see temperatures go above about a half a degree Celsius compared to historical normals, that's when bumblebee communities start to really shift in their community composition, where those warm adapted species take off and those cool adapted species really start to decline. So those big scale patterns kind of tell us kind of generally what's happening with these communities over time, but that doesn't really tell us what might happen as a result of that. We know these species are changing in their abundance and their occurrence, but what about the pollination services that they're providing to both natural plant communities and to agricultural crops? What's going on there? So how might we actually expect pollination to change in response to a changing climate? So we're going to walk through a couple hypothetical examples here. And we're going to imagine for a given species, there's kind of two main hypotheses that we might see. And we're going to return here to this thermal performance curve that we looked at earlier and kind of imagine these different scenarios, these different hypotheses in context of this. So as a reminder, we have this thermal performance curve where we have a temperature increase to kind of this maximum rate of development or metabolism, followed by a rapid decrease. And kind of beyond that peak point is what we kind of think of as this extreme heat risk zone, where temperatures are no longer tolerable for this species, and we start to see a decline in their performance. So if we imagine a species of insect that's active relatively early in the season or earlier in its thermal performance curve, kind of on this upward slope right here, as temperatures increase, so we're imagining on the x-axis here, this is where our historical temperatures kind of have been. Here's where they're going to be in the next 50 to 100 years. What we're probably going to see is an increase in this insect's performance over time, ultimately a good thing for this particular insect species, as the temperatures in the future will be closer to their optimal value. On the flip side, if insects are active during or near to their peak of performance in terms of temperature, and temperature is going to increase from there, we would expect to see a decrease in mean activity or performance for this particular species of insect. So this outcome is also going to ultimately depend not only on the single species, but the community of species that are present in a given place. So if we imagine a pollinator community that's relatively diverse, that has 5 different species, we tend to see that these different species have different thermal tolerances. So we have individual species temperature tolerances here represented by these different colored kind of curves right here. And we have this really broad thermal community for the entire community because we have all these different species that represent different temperature tolerances. However, if we imagine that some of these species are lost from this community for one reason or another, either due to habitat loss or a variety of other factors, we tend to see that thermal performance or the thermal activity ability for that community shrinks down quite a bit. So we no longer have that redundancy, and that community is no longer going to be as able to provide these services in the face of warm temperatures. So another way to put that basically is that communities over here are likely to be stable, activity is likely to be stable, pollination services are likely to be more stable during something like a heat wave, because we have these species of insect here that can tolerate those warm conditions. On the flip side, over here, activity or pollination performance is likely to decrease during a heat wave because we've lost those warm adapted species from this community. They're no longer there to be able to do these services in these kind of adverse conditions. And we think about the effects of things like global change and climate change specifically manifesting in a couple of different ways. So when temperature increases happen for pollinators, their effects can be either direct or they can be indirect. And what I mean by that basically is, imagine we have warming temperatures that can directly impact an insect. So that is through the stress on the individual insect itself. So through basically like a decrease in metabolism or reproductive rate, or feeding or foraging rates and stuff like that from those temperatures on the individual. Those are direct effects that we can measure. However, there's also indirect effects to consider here. So imagine a situation because bumblebees and other pollinators are explicitly dependent on plants. They need to eat pollen and nectar in order to provision their young with food, right? That's the sole source of nutrients for these groups of species. And if we imagine temperatures not only affecting them, it's also affecting these plants. So if a majority of the impact of climate change is actually mediated through the plant community, through reductions in pollen production or nectar production, that's something that we really want to know, because this is going to impact how we actually go about designing resilience or adaptation capacities for these systems. We'll want to know if we need to focus on the insects themselves or on the environment that they're in and the resources that they depend on. And other things are at play in here too, such as things like land use change and agricultural practices as well. So these warming temperatures on bumblebees or insects, pollinators more generally, can have both these direct and indirect effects on pollination. So as temperatures warm up, we might see these direct effects manifest through changes in foraging behavior, for example. So bumblebees, for example, might take fewer foraging trips for pollen. They might have to increase their thermal regulation costs, as they have to sit and kind of pump that heat out of their body more regularly, and that's going to inhibit them from doing things like flying to plants and actually pollinating them. We'd also expect to see a change indirectly here through changes in the plant community, through a reduction in nectar production or quality, and ultimately a reduction in attractiveness of these plants to insects and to pollinators. And ultimately, both of these things are going to cascade down to the pollination services that these insects are providing. So the negative impacts of warming temperatures are especially easy to imagine during these periods of extreme heat, which we call heat waves. So we're going to kind of use this as an example to try to parse apart these direct and indirect impacts on insects. And we're going to think, okay, if we imagine a hypothetical heat wave that occurs over the course of a week, what might we imagine happening? So we're going to look at 4 different scenarios here. The first of which is kind of before the heat wave happens, where everything's kind of hunky-dory. Like the flowers are developing in normal conditions, the bees are foraging under normal conditions, and everyone kind of has what they need. But as temperatures start to really rapidly increase, as the heat wave sets on, bees are immediately thrust into having to fly in this period of extreme heat. But the flowers that they're foraging on are those that have developed a couple days before that extreme heat happens. There's this kind of lagged effect here. So what this allows us to do is this scenario allows us to test specifically the direct impact of heat on pollinators. If the heat wave progresses and continues for several days, we might start to see kind of the worst case scenario here, where we have both bees now having to deal with extreme temperatures, and the flowers that they're foraging on have now developed under extreme conditions. So this scenario here allows us to look at the interactive or the additive effects of that heat on both bees and the plants that they're foraging on. And finally, after the heat wave subsides, these bees are going to breathe a collective sigh of relief. They're back to foraging in normal conditions, but they're dealing with this kind of ghost of heat waves past, because the flowers they're foraging on have still been those that have developed under extreme heat. So it's going to take several days before, or weeks potentially, before the plants recover from that extreme heat and the flowers are no longer affected by that process. So this scenario allows us to test that indirect impact specifically through the plant and how that impacts the pollinator. So each of those scenarios kind of neatly aligns itself into what we call a factorial experiment design. So we can manipulate flower development temperature and bee foraging temperature to test each of those scenarios independently to be able to parse apart whether it's the direct impact, the indirect impact, or some combination thereof that's the most important thing driving pollinator behavior and their pollination services. So what's really cool about this experimental design is not only does it allow us to parse those things out, but like we talked about just a couple seconds ago, each of these treatment combinations is a biologically realistic scenario that we see play out, which is really kind of unique to this particular experiment. And this allows us to ask this question of what the impact of this increased flower development and foraging temperature is on bumblebees themselves. So here we're going to use bumblebees again as an example. So this is an experiment that I did with a colleague of mine in California a couple of years ago. And what we basically did to test this out is we built these treatment chambers to simulate heat waves. So we built these plant treatment chambers where we subjected a version of canola, which is an oilseed crop that we grow in northern Minnesota and large parts of the upper Midwest. And we subjected these canola plants to these heat waves in these chambers. And then we moved them into these bee foraging chambers where they were again subjected to either control conditions where they're kind of in a happy temperature, or heat wave conditions where we let bumblebees forage on these plants for a period of time. And what we did is we recorded all of the bee activity within these chambers using little tiny computers and cameras. And we're able to basically look at every single interaction that these bees had with the plants that they were foraging on to measure every different characteristic of pollination, of the pollination process that we might be interested in. So this is what these chambers look like in real life. This is my colleague Nick, who I did this experiment with. So he's the kind of hardcore pollination ecologist and plant reproductive biologist. I'm kind of the bumblebee guy and the kind of MacGyver dude who built these chambers. So chamber on the left here is the heat chamber, what we kind of collectively call the chamber of despair. So we just stick these poor little bees and plants into this, 96-degree box for a period of time. Then we had this other chamber over here, which we called the chamber of false hope, which I'll kind of get into why we called it that in a little bit. But uh, kind of the most fun part about being an ecologist is this sort of work, is being able to kind of build these really cool experiments and doing this kind of stuff. Even if the results are usually pretty depressing, it is fun to be able to do this with colleagues and figure out creative ways to test out these problems and figure out what's going on. So what we found is that these heat waves have a pretty profound impact, not only on the plants, but on the bees. So we're going to start by looking at just the plants. What we found is that heat waves reduced canola nectar production by about 75%. So if we looked at an average flower, these flowers tended to have about a microliter of nectar in normal conditions. But when the heat waves happened, that got cut by 75%. So they're only producing about a 0.3 or 0.25 microliters at that point because of those extreme conditions. And we saw this manifest as well from the bee side. And this is going to be kind of complicated to look at, but I just want to kind of walk you through what we're looking at here. So this is called an interaction plot. So on the x-axis here, we have the bee treatment conditions. So we're either looking at the bees in control conditions on the left-hand side of the figure, or in heat wave conditions on the right-hand side of the figure. And then finally, the colors of these lines are the flower conditions. So either flowers develop under normal conditions in yellow, or hot conditions, the heat wave conditions, in red here. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So for the number of times that bees actually went out to forage, so we connected these little tiny colonies to these boxes, what we found is that these bees really didn't change the number of times they would go out, regardless of the temperature conditions or the conditions of the plant. They still went out to forage about as frequently. But what we did see is that they spent significantly less time foraging on these plants through a combination of the direct effect of heat on themselves and the indirect effect through of heat through the plant itself. So we have this additive effect happening here where when bees and plants are hot, we see the most dramatic decrease in the amount of time that bumblebees are out foraging on plants and pollinating these plants. And ultimately, what that reduction in foraging duration was from was that bees visit fewer plants and fewer flowers during these periods of extreme heat. So they're just either too stressed themselves, or they're receptive to the fact that these plants are no longer producing the rewards that they want, so they're visiting them less frequently. What that ultimately means then is that they're probably doing a worse job pollinating them. And of course, we didn't only measure every aspect about the bees' foraging behavior, we also measured every single aspect about the plant reproductive capacity as well. So this is the kind of plant room that we use to pre-treat the plants and to get everything situated. And we measured a whole host of different characteristics across the entire pollination process. So I'm not going to go through the specific individual relationships that we found from this, but I'll kind of give you a broad overview of what we found just by first focusing on what we looked at. So we looked at the pollination process. So we looked at how much pollen was actually removed from these plants, how much of that pollen was then deposited on receptive stigmas on the plants as well. We looked at what are called post-pollination effects, which is pollen viability and pollen tube survival. So whether or not these pollen tubes are able to successfully fertilize plants. And finally, the reproductive output as well. And what I'm going to look at here and show you is basically it results from an early part of this process and the very dead end part of this process. So we're going to look at pollen removal, and we're going to look at seed set and how that relates to these different temperature conditions. And what we found is that relative to when things are in normal temperatures, when bees are foraging under extreme heat, we saw about a 55% reduction in pollen deposition and a 67% reduction in seed set. So pretty dramatic. We're losing about half of the productive capacity of the system just because the bees are too hot. When just the plants are heated, so looking at that indirect effect, we see an even larger result. So 71% reduction in pollen deposition and almost a 97% reduction in seed set in these canola plants. And finally, the worst case scenario of when both the bees and the plants are subjected to these extreme conditions, an 87% reduction in pollen deposition and a 99% reduction in seed set. So pretty profound, almost a total collapse of the system. And just to give you a kind of better sense of what these numbers mean, we're going to walk through a little cartoonized example here where we imagine a situation where we start with 200 grains of pollen being removed from an anther. How many of those grains of pollen actually will successfully be transferred from a pollen grain to a seed? So for those 200 grains of pollen, only one of them will successfully sire a seed when both bees and plants are subjected to these extreme heat conditions. So not a great outcome for this situation. And these are relatively mild temperature heat waves as well, 95 to 90, 93 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is warm for where canola is grown, but it's not unheard of. So the heat domes that happened in northern or in southern Canada in 2021, for example, those temperatures were upwards of 115 degrees Fahrenheit across the primary canola producing regions of North America. So we're still regularly seeing opportunities for these temperatures to be breached due to heat waves. So from this work, what we've seen is that heat waves can really substantially alter the resource landscape that's out there for insects. So we're seeing a big reduction in nectar and pollen reproduction. That's going to threaten pollination for the plants themselves, but also the capacity for these insects to bring in the resources that they need to survive themselves. We also see that these heat waves are affecting bumblebee foraging behavior, and that's primarily through a reduction of both of foraging times for direct stress on the individuals and because of the resource environment that they're facing. And this can elicit these really massive reductions in plant reproduction due to a bottleneck happening during pollination primarily. So this study was really awesome and allowed us to kind of really nicely parse apart what's going on here. But there's a lot of different limitations about looking at a study system like this. For one, we're only looking at two species. We're looking at one species of flower and one species of insect. And in reality, there's always more complicating factors when we look at these situations in the field. And we know a lot of the different characteristics that are out there in the real world might actually be able to kind of make these systems more resilient to these heat wave conditions. So for example, like we talked about earlier, what if the species that we're looking at in this aren't the ones that are responding the most, are the ones that are responding strongest to climate aren't actually the best pollinators. So for example here, if we imagine this situation where the species that we've lost from this community are the species that are on this blue line here, and what I'm going to explain here is this figure, what we're basically looking at is the mean proportion of visits that species will make to a plant as the species goes from the highest abundance on the left here to its lowest abundance on the right. So basically, there's majority of pollinator visits that are happening from like 5 species of pollinator. So imagine the species that we're looking at in that example are actually somewhere down here where they're really not visiting the plant all that much. If that's the case, then this system might actually be relatively robust to climate change because we have all these other pollinators that are still present and able to provide those visitations and that pollination service. It's also important to remember that changes in those activity rates that we're seeing might not be the only consequence of climate change on insect pollinators. We also see these phenological effects that we talked about earlier, where we see these changes in when pollinators are active relative to when the plants that they're supposed to be pollinating are active. And do we actually see that happen? So will these warmer conditions actually impact bee phenology? So this is a really awesome experiment that my colleague and friend Paul Caradonna did a few years ago with a different species of pollinator. Here we're looking at Osmia ribiflorus, which is a type of mason bee that occurs in the desert Southwest. And what they basically try to figure out is, are we seeing this phenological shift happen due to climate change from this insect? So osmia are a little bit of a unique insect, or a unique bee, in that they have a different life cycle to what we were looking at before with bumblebees, and that they have this kind of adult diapause. So what they basically means is in January and February, these bees will emerge from their overwintering sites. They will mate and then forage on pollen and nectar, and then provision their nest in February and March in the desert Southwest. And from that point forward, the adults will die out, and the bees are basically developing in these little tiny tubes. They tend to be in these little tiny nest blocks that we put out in the landscape, and they'll develop in those nest blocks for the remainder of the year. So what Paul was actually able to do was to simulate climate change on these nest blocks through a really simple and elegant experiment. What he did was basically take these nest blocks and paint them different colors. So we had nest blocks that were white, nest blocks that were black, and nest blocks that were this natural wood color. And these basically simulated natural wood colors were just normal conditions, kind of, as we would expect. Black was a climate change scenario of an increase in temperature, because black is going to absorb more solar radiation, raise the heat, the temperature rather, in those nest blocks. And white was kind of a cooling treatment, where the white is going to reflect that temperature away, or that sun away, and lower the temperature in those nest blocks. And what he found is that for this species of osmia, yes, indeed, when we warm these temperatures up, warming temperatures actually delays the emergence of these individuals. So for both males and females across multiple years, we saw that they, when subjected to these warming conditions, came out on average 10 or so days later than they typically would, due to thermal stress during their development. Now, if plants are responding in a similar rate, that's probably not a big deal. But if the plants aren't changing as much, we're starting to see that phenological synchrony happen, or asynchrony happen, where we're no longer overlapping the activity patterns of these two different groups. But we also can imagine that that phenological synchrony can be stabilized due to the thermal diversity among pollinators. So we've talked a couple of different times now about the importance of this biological diversity in stabilizing these ecological processes like pollination. And there's been some really good evidence that we've accumulated over the past decade or so to show that that's exactly what we see happen. So this is an example from upstate New York in the US, looking at apple pollinators and apple pollination. And what this study was able to find basically is that using a really long-term data set from the 1960s onward, we really don't tend to see any major separation between apple bloom and apple pollinator activity across this upper part of the Northeast. So these lines basically here, the dashed line here is the activity collection, average activity of pollinators, and the black line here is the average bloom date for apple. And these lines are almost perfectly parallel, so they're not deviating over time, suggesting that there's an asynchrony happening. They're staying pretty much right on line with one another over time. And what that ultimately is due to is the fact that individual bee species are responding differently to a changing and warming climate. So some species are actually increasing in the amount of asynchrony that they're experiencing, like this green line here and this gray line here, but others are at the same time decreasing. And the average of all these ups and downs is basically a flat line in terms of the asynchrony between when bees are coming out and when apple is blooming. So the diversity of this community is stabilizing this pollination service being provided to these apple orchards. What they're able to do basically using these data sets is to do what's called a process called bootstrapping, which is a statistical technique, which we basically take a bunch of stuff out of the data set and rerun it. It allows us to basically determine at what number of species in the community do we stabilize these pollination services. And what they found is that after you increase to about 10 to 12 species of bees in the community, we tend to see a really stable availability of bees and a lower amount of asynchrony between when bees are out and when flowers are out. But when there are fewer species in the community, so when there's only two, there's much more asynchrony because now there's not as much redundancy in when those insects are out and available. So they might actually be responding too strongly to climate and no longer able to provide pollination services. It's also the case that this is stabilized over time as well. So rather than just the synchrony over time, the rate of change that we see in that asynchrony is also much, much lower the more species that we have in this community. So looking at a couple of the big picture takeaways here, we know that insects are responding to a changing climate. We're seeing these long-term temperature increases that are driving really big shifts in insect communities through both changes in where they're occurring and in how abundant they are in the communities that they're present. We also see that pollination services are at risk from a warming climate. The temperature can negatively affect both bees and the plants, leading to strong additive reductions in things like seed production, particularly in the canola example that we looked at. But the extent of the risk to these changes is still pretty unknown. Only a handful of species have really been studied in depth. And we see that these diverse bee communities with variation in thermal tolerance might buffer these ecological functions against a rapidly warming climate. But the caveat with this is that that's only if these species remain present in the communities. And like we talked about earlier, it's not just a changing climate that's driving whether or not species are being lost from these communities or not. There are a whole host of other factors that we're seeing species being lost to. So it's an important thing to consider. So thinking forward a little bit, it's important to remember here that temperature increases are really only just getting started. So we should continue to see these significant changes in insect community composition over the next 50 to 100 years, especially given the relatively low progress we've had in controlling emissions. And there's a bunch of different critical questions that we have to address moving forward if we want to know what the impact is going to be on things like pollinator-dependent crops here in the Midwest. The first of which is how can we help these cool adapted species to cope? And whether or not these cool adapted species are the ones performing a lot of these pollination services. Also, how can we address these sorts of changes for bee species for which we don't have a lot of data? We actually know relatively little about almost all bee species out there. Bumblebees are kind of an exception, and even within that group, it's really only a handful of species that we know a lot about. And then finally, which crops and plants are going to be the most at risk given where we're expecting to see the highest rates of warming and extreme weather events moving forward? So with that, we are just after 2 o'clock. So I'm happy to kind of wrap things up here and open the floor up for questions. So thanks so much for everyone's time, and hopefully the folks have some fun discussion to have after that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Oh my gosh, when I saw your presentation, I knew it was going to be a good one, and I was correct. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah,
Thank
no
you.
problem.
I mean, your research does a great job at really applying your forward thinking and applicable data that's coming out of there. So you could see all the different emojis coming out. Hopefully.
Yeah, definitely.
We do have quite a few questions, so I'm trying to kind of combine
Yep.
and curate these in a way that can help everyone. So maybe starting a little bit more broadly, there's been some folks that have noticed definitely a decrease in the number of pollinators in their area, especially compared to previous years. And this might be a very broad question, but what do you think is going on in the environment? Is it very localized? Is it all climate? Is it neonicotinoids? Is it what would you think is the main contributing factor here?
Yeah, great questions. And the unfortunate answer, unfortunately, is it's probably a combination of a lot of different things. So one of the big challenges we have with insect populations is that they're very difficult to measure and ascribe changes, specific changes in environment to, because insect populations are naturally inherently very variable over time. This is like related to the fact that they're so driven by temperature. So we can see naturally very big swings in insect availability or insect abundance from year to year, not due to any kind of illicit or pernicious causes like climate change or land use change or something like that, but just because temperatures are just they're going to vary from year to year. And unfortunately, what that means though is that as the climate continues to shift, if the shifts that are happening are in line with the conditions that are not good for insects, then we're going to start to see these swings get larger and potentially dip down into where we can see localized extinctions start to happen. But it's important to remember that we have all these other things happening simultaneously with a changing climate. So it really depends on the location, depends on the location and which factors are happening. So some of the data that we have from places like California, we have this really awesome kind of natural experiment where we can track insect populations across a gradient from the Central Valley all the way up into the Sierra Nevada. And what that does for us is that not only is climate change happening in those places simultaneously, but the land use patterns that are happening there are very, very different. So the Central Valley is an intensive agricultural area, whereas the Sierra Nevada are almost entirely untouched in terms of land use, right? Yes, there's been logging, there's been some stuff, but relatively speaking, the only impacts that have happened there have been due to climate, whereas there's a combination in the Central Valley. And when we look at climatic changes and how that impacts things like butterflies, what we actually see is that the biggest rates of change due to climate are actually up in the Sierra, both because temperature changes there have been happening more rapidly than they have in the valley, but also that these are areas totally removed from land use change. So we can really ascribe the change there specifically to climate, whereas in the valley, it's more complicated. We know there's other factors at play. So that's one of the challenges. And then the other challenge is like our capacity to actually go out and measure insect populations robustly takes a lot of time and a lot of resources because of that inherent variability. So that's one thing that we need to do moving forward is just do a better job of doing monitoring work, of actually just knowing what's happening with insect populations for 5, 10, 15, 20-year periods before we can really start to point fingers on which specific causes are driving population numbers, which is frustrating, but also a little heartening because we know what we need to do. It's just manifesting and marshaling the resources to do that is challenging. But it's also a really great period of time to be doing that because there's all these new technologies that are kind of coming online to monitor insects more robustly using AI and a bunch of other tools, which is really awesome. So there are some bright spots in that.
It sounds like you're really at the forefront of that. So hopefully in 20 years, we'll be able to look back at this and say, oh, Jeremy told us.
Oh, well, hopefully it's not I told you so. Hopefully
Yeah.
it's a better story. Yeah.
So let's see, a little bit macro view of this. Is most of this data relevant to the Northern Hemisphere? Is the Southern Hemisphere experiencing these changes too?
Yep, they absolutely are. Yeah. So the temperature changes that we are seeing tend to be worst and most exacerbated the farther north that you go, but they're also happening in the inverse pattern in the southern hemisphere as well. But because a majority of the land mass that we think about and a lot of the data that we have is available in the northern hemisphere, it tends to be biased because of that. So this is this basic scientific publication bias in terms of like where data is available, and the global south is repeatedly and consistently underrepresented in these data sets because of a lack of resources, a lack of actual scientific work that's going on in some of these areas as well, but primarily just through a lack of resources and uh, our ability to network with these scientists is more reduced, and we need to do a better job of that.
I think there's always should haves and could haves
Yep.
in research. Let's see. There's a couple of questions, more about like the evolutionary change. Uh, is there evidence that warming temperatures have affected either the capacity of queens to lay eggs or the sperm survival of male bees? Or another question, can natural selection make certain species more tolerant to higher temperatures? How is that evolutionary change?
Yeah, so the first part, we don't know a ton. So for the best evidence that we have at this point is primarily in bumblebees for high temperatures, some in solitary bees as well. But for bumblebees, we tend to think of the biggest stressors likely being on male fertility, on sperm. And the reason for that is for bumblebees, most of them are, not all, but most are nesting underground or in confined, relatively temperature controlled environments, which means that the queens are less susceptible to those temperature fluctuations that we're seeing in kind of the ambient world. during heat waves, for example. But when males are out and mating with queens, they're always only out mating in the environment. So if temperatures are really hot at the end of the summer, that can really affect spermatogenesis, sperm production in males, or sperm viability in males, just like it can in plants with pollen. So that's something that we tend to see. Evolutionarily, kind of thinking about natural selection, yes, this is actually these changes are a very big selective pressure to select for species or for individuals that are tolerant to these conditions. But the challenge with that is that the rate of change that we're seeing in the temperatures is likely far too great for natural selection to be an effective mechanism to adapt to these changes. So a great example is with some of my work we've looked at is what we talked about with the large scale changes in bumblebee communities in North America. So for the warm adapted species, what we found is that even warm adapted species north of 50 degrees latitude, so basically the Canadian border and up, even the warm adapted species are declining because the rate of temperature change is just too fast for them to be able to tolerate it. And we don't tend to see bumblebees moving northward at the rates at which they would need to move in order to adapt to the conditions on the ground. And this is not only due to they have the physical capacity; they can fly these distances to migrate or to immigrate to these new areas. But we think that there might be an interaction with land use here, where they just don't have the capacity to track resources, to find pathways through either really intensive agricultural landscapes or for other reasons to kind of move their populations northward. At the same time, they're being squished on the southern end due to inhospitably warm conditions. So they're kind of getting sandwiched a lot, which is not great, which kind of brings the question, do we need to start to facilitate some of these movements of these individuals via like translocations? And this is an active area of the conversation and debate within the community.
See. There's a few of the questions are talking about generalist versus specialist species. Are there studies on differences in the heat tolerance between the two? Are these niches, would they make them more advantageous in certain circumstances? Do you have any information on that?
So a little bit, yeah. So I mean, generally what we find is that the generalist species tend to be the ones that are doing better. So in bumblebees, for example, the two kind of big examples in the eastern United States, there's Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, hugely generalist, is doing very well, has increased in abundance dramatically. Um, on the West Coast, Bombus vosnesensky is this kind of parallel example, hugely generalist, doing quite well, seems to be relatively tolerant to warm conditions. But there are, even with them, there are limitations. So the experiment that we did in the chambers was with Bombus impatiens, and 95 degrees is not all that hot relative to what this species range is. It goes all the way down into Florida and the southern U.S., where those temperatures are breached regularly during the summer. So, you know, sometimes generalists are doing better, but it really depends on the location and the species and when they're coming out and foraging. That really is going to depend. The answer will depend largely on that.
And to be a little bit more specific to Minnesota and the upper Midwest, do you know of any of these generalist species of bumblebees that will be most adapted to these changes?
Yeah, so like here we're seeing impatiens, Grizzioculus, the brown-belted bumblebee, Bombus bimaculatus to some extent, maybe not so much as with the heat tolerance because they tend to be more of an earlier season species, but they have been increasing quite a bit in most of the upper Midwest and in Minnesota in particular. And we're also starting to see some of the Western generalist species creep eastward quite a bit more. Things like Bombus huntii, which are in the Dakotas and may end up here at some point, that seem to be pretty well adapted to these conditions as well.
And then on the flip side, do you have an insect or insects that normally thrive in Minnesota that could possibly become extinct with the future temperatures?
So it's hard to be specific about whether climate is the cause, but one of the concerning species I have from my research is Bombus terricola, which is the yellow-banded bumblebee, and this has been a formerly pretty, historically was a pretty abundant species. We don't know if the primary reason for its decline is land use or climate. It looks to be more of a land use driven issue because it's seems very intolerant to disturbed landscapes. It really prefers these kind of open wetlands and wood and savanna areas and that we tended to have in this part of the world. And we don't have as much data for them to kind of ascribe specifically climatic effects, but hopefully we can start to kind of dive into this a little bit more. Bombus affinis is on everybody's mind, of course, but we don't know for sure about climatic factors with them. It's kind of an open question as well. There's been much more focus with them on the resource question or on neonicotinoids and other factors as well. But undoubtedly, climate plays into all of this because it's one of those things that just it touches everything. It interacts with all these different factors.
Unfortunately.
Yep. Yeah.
Um, we have some really great questions. It's almost hard for me to decide which one. Um, what did bees do to survive past ice ages and warm eras? Do we have any information on that? And does that indicate possibilities for the current climate change?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. And the truthful answer is I have absolutely no idea. Typically, yeah, I'm gonna punt on that one entirely. I can do some reading though to see what we might be able to do, but unfortunately we don't have data from those eras. But tend with other taxa, what we tend to see happen is that, there's a recedence of populations as that happens, but then as ice recedes, the animals are able to basically infill back as those landscapes become available again. So that tends to be what happens, but that is, glacier, geologic timescales versus, our measly, human timescales.
Quite small when we think about it.
Yeah. Great question though. That'll I'll be thinking about that one today.
So we might see future studies based on that. Um, this one is interesting. So I know that this is a topic in the area of trees and assisted migration. Is this a viable option for helping bumblebee or just general pollinator populations?
We maybe it's a potential. So there's been discussions, particularly around Bombus affinis, about doing assisted reintroductions and like to do rearing operations to like bulk up numbers of queens and then re-releasing those into the environment. Um, how we would go about doing that is still relatively an open question. The kind of neat things about things like bumblebees is that we have a pretty good capacity to rear them in the lab to some extent. It varies a lot by species, though, how tolerant they are to being able to be reared in artificial conditions. So it very much depends, but that's something that is considered for bumblebees and for other insect species to be able to tolerate these temperature conditions is certainly. But then you get into other issues of, how far outside of their range are we pushing these things? Are they going to have problematic effects on the native species that typically did occur there? And for impatiens, particularly for Bombus impatiens, I mean, it's found its way all over the place. I mean, it's now established in British Columbia, which is like far, far, far outside of its native range. It's called a common eastern bumblebee for a reason. And now there's naturally reproducing queens in the environment there. So there's a chance for these species to kind of get unintentionally introduced. And the reason for the impatiens one is because it is commercially reared for agricultural production and for greenhouse production, primarily of things like tomatoes. And so you can purchase these colonies of Bombus impatiens and stick them into your fields or into your greenhouse, and they'll come out and pollinate. So that's one of the challenges is that that's happening kind of maybe unintentionally in the background as well as potential intentional efforts that might happen in the future.
Sure. And it sounds like Angie will be talking about that on Thursday. So that's another little reminder that this will be all week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So join us. Thank you for joining us today, but also join us for the next few days. Has anyone studied the effect of predators of bees with regard to the increasing temperatures?
Offhand, I don't know of anything. So right now we're really still kind of in a very much of a early phase of research on temperature impacts on insects. I mean, particularly with regard to extreme temperatures. I mean, we've been studying temperatures in insects for time immemorial, basically, because we've known that temperature is the critical determinant of their development. So like things like degree day models and all of that are built for insects on temperature. But in terms of things like what we think of as this would be maybe a bitrophic or tritrophic interaction, so multiple different trophic levels. those are only just being started to be looked at in terms of temperature and pollinators. So very much an open question still. Oop, you're muted, Tara, just so you know.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just started talking to myself. So, being that agroecology is part of your background, do you have opinions on which agricultural communities or these crop types would be most receptive to these mitigation strategies? We'll be talking about this a little bit tomorrow, and for the farming and the ag discussion, but just wanted to see if that you had an opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that the groups that tend to be the most, I mean, all the growers that I've worked with and talked with over the past 10 or so years are all cognizant of these challenges. But the groups that are by far the most concerned are the ones that are really dependent on these insects for production, right? So pollinator dependent crop growers. So in the Midwest, folks like cranberry and blueberry and apple production and squash production are really concerned, I think, with some of these trends in temperature and in pollinator community populations. Um, from some of my work out in California, almond growers, other folks are also concerned about these things as well. But I know commodity growers of people who are growing corn and soy who are cognizant of them and who want to do things to help. And ultimately, we need everyone on board, ideally, to try to do things because as much as these insects are important to specialty crops like cranberries and apples and whatnot, in reality, most of the landscape is in corn and soy. And these are the areas where these insects have historically existed and need to historic or to exist in the future. So we need to figure out ways to make these landscapes as amenable to these communities of insects as possible, so that they're producing, so they're benefiting not only the agricultural communities, but the natural communities that are still present in these places as well. So because it's not always we're going to be growing corn and soy in the exact same locations or the exact same quantities that we do now potentially. So thinking a little bit more forward about how we want these systems to function, in 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years is a challenging question when, meeting the needs of here and now is really hard, but something that we need to definitely consider as well.
That's a great segue to my next question. But before I do, I want to be cognizant of time. We only have about 7 minutes left, and I wanted to first launch the poll. Let's see here. If I launch it here, you should be able to answer these questions about Jeremy's presentation. Fantastic, but this does really help us curate presenters into the future. So we really appreciate your feedback, and the window should disappear after you click submit, so you can keep watching and keep looking at the chat. But we have time for a few more questions. And you were talking about the different groups of people that can enact change. What, if anything, can small landowners do when establishing pollinator habitats? There was another question, should we be incorporating seeds of species that are growing in and adapted to warmer climates, so they might be better adapted to producing pollen? What are your recommendations?
Yeah, definitely. So the same sorts of recommendations that we would think of for pollinators generally apply in the context of climate. So it really is a question still of providing habitat and reprieve from insecticide use for these insects. So planting floral resources for bees that are native and adapted to these conditions and that are going to provide resources for these insects, from as early as possible in the spring to as late as possible in the late summer and fall, and spanning that whole span in between is really critical. Um, in terms of including species that are more warm adapted, that's definitely something that we will want to consider moving forward. And that's, I think, an active area of research, not only in the US, but also in the EU, about European Union, about doing this sort of kind of forward-thinking conservation, planning for these, climates of tomorrow, basically, of terms of developing seed mixtures. I think that's important to consider for specific areas as well. Whether or not it's going to be as impactful here in the Midwest, I think the primary concern we'll have to think about here is things like drought. While temperatures will go up here, I think most of the conditions will probably still be within the range of amenable temperatures for most native plant species. There's some obvious exceptions probably. but we'll have to be cognizant of it. But definitely things that are drought adapted. You know, 2 summers ago was a great example. It was bone dry here. I live in the Twin Cities, and luckily, my pollinator garden out front has a lot of things that are relatively drought adapted. So I was still seeing pretty decent insect activity, but that's really critical to consider as well. Is not only the temperature aspect, but the precipitation.
And do you think microclimates would have an importance in that where, you might see different foraging activity in like shade area? Do you think of it more on a micro scale or as a macro climate issue?
Definitely both, but the microclimate is another kind of area of my research that is just kind of again in its infancy. We've done some preliminary experiments to try to get at this idea, and it's definitely important. We see just from kind of large scale data we can kind of do some data sciencey stuff with that insects are really cognizant and respond to microclimates. And, we think about temperatures varying, on our scale, but even within a plant, like on a leaf, there can be 20 degrees C difference between, individual points on a leaf in terms of temperature, which is crazy. And we're not experiencing that level of microclimate, but the insects that are foraging on these plants absolutely are. So yeah, creating like these relatively shaded areas for insects to have reprieve during uh, really warm periods is pretty critical, and also making sure that the plants are well irrigated and are able to kind of tolerate these conditions themselves is also pretty critical.
Well, I think that should probably wrap up our Q&A time. We didn't answer all of the questions, but
And
if
I'm totally happy too. If you want to send questions my way that we didn't get to, I can try to answer some of them and you can send them out.
we can do that, or would you prefer me to just share your email with?
Let's do that. You can just share them in one format, and that way I can kind of get them all at once versus a bunch of different emails. But
Sounds great.
folks can also reach out to me via email if they have questions.
Perfect. So, and also, if there was any questions very specific to your local area, I'll also be sharing out all the contact information for the local extension educators if we weren't able to answer your very specific questions. So thank you so much to all the audience members and the panelists for your great participation, your great questions. I can see all the emojis flying. Yes, this has been recorded, and I'll be sending this recording out on Friday at the end of the series. And that wraps up our first session of the climate resilient pollinator habitats across Minnesota landscapes. Thank you for participating with us today. And tomorrow's presentation, as I alluded to, will cover the topic of pollinators and climate change, making an impact on the farm. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jeremy. I think everyone was very impressed, so I'm very honored to have you on today.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much everyone for taking the time, and hopefully we can all connect again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.